Welcome to Voices of the Hill, a public affairs podcast produced by the communication program at Culver Stockton College in Canton, Missouri. I'm Dustin Pruitt. In each episode, we sit down with members of the Wildcat community, students, professors, administrators, staff, alumni, trustees, and friends of the college to share their stories, experiences, and insights from the Hill and beyond. Today, I'm with students in the History of Communication class here at C-SC. They will be introducing themselves and asking our special guest questions about their time here at Culver and career. We have with us today Jonathan Swain, a proud Culver Stockton College alumni who works in public relations and strategic communication. We'll be talking about his journey into PR and communication, what keeps him connected to Culver Stockton, and his thoughts on leadership and education. Jonathan, welcome to Voices of the Hill, and thanks for having this conversation with us.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here and happy to be back on the Hill.
We're glad you're here also. Before your days as a Wildcat, let's go back to where your journey started. When you were a teenager, what did you want to do for your career?
Well, that's a good question to go back all those years. I'd maybe start with I grew up in Kennett, Missouri, which is in the Boot Heel of Missouri. I often say closer to Memphis than St. Louis. And I, in high school, was active but not really clear on what I wanted to do. My parents had always encouraged us to go to college, and among the places I applied was Culver Stockton. Neither of my parents went to college. I'm a first-gen college student, and Culver Stockton offered me a scholarship, and so that kind of made the decision. In some ways that, I always say Culver Stockton kind of happened to me as opposed to I know some people, their parents have gone to Culver Stockton and that helps inform their decision. But for me, the financial aid was a big thing. When I got here and had to declare a major or choose a major and where I was going to focus, I really kind of drew back on one of the things that I really enjoyed in high school, which was working on the high school yearbook. I was a photographer, and I always thought that was I just enjoyed that interaction and what we did producing the yearbook. And so that drove me into but really helped inform that as I was looking at my options for majors, that the journalism major that Culver Stockton offered at the time made the most sense for me.
Awesome. French?
My name is French. Since you went to Canton High School, I'm actually from that part of that area, from Poplar Bluff, Missouri.
Oh, great.
So when you went to Canton High School, what activities did you participate in?
I think that's great, and it's nice to meet someone else from southeast Missouri. I think for me, I was not necessarily involved in sports, but I was very active in various student organizations. Like I mentioned, I was on the high school yearbook. I was a photographer, so I was one of the people who was out basically at every event taking photos and documenting things so that we could chronicle it in the yearbook. And in addition to that, I was in like the student theater productions, working on the crews and things like that. I was in band. We had a great marching band. I always, I think, while I enjoyed my classroom learning and everything, a lot of where I my interests were kind of driven was just through my activities and involvement in organizations. So things like that were really where I spent a lot of time.
Awesome. Now, as we shift into your Culver years, I'll hand things over to Maddox.
Hi, I'm Maddox. We kind of already answered this question, but why did you come to Culver?
Well, and I'll add a little bit more context on that. Like I said, neither of my parents had gone to college, but they'd always encouraged us that college should be in our future. And I think, again, good for them. One of their goals was that they had 4 kids, that their 4 kids would have the opportunity to go to college, because I think both of them saw that had they been able to, maybe would have provided some opportunities that they didn't have otherwise. And my older brother had gone to a small school, Westminster College, here in Missouri also. I was this person who was at the time eager to get out of a small town, and I would always say to my mom, I'm going to go to UCLA or someplace I'd seen on TV. But I think because of my older brother's experience at a small school like Westminster, my parents were very encouraging of looking at small schools. And there was one guy that had been a senior when I was a freshman in high school who came to Culver Stockton College, and as best I can remember, an admissions counselor from Culver Stockton showed up at our high school one day. I think her son actually is in school here. Her name was Kelly Cox Capps, I think. And she, I guess, really encouraged me to apply, and then stayed in touch, called, and that, I think that outreach, that one-on-one attention really helped. And obviously the scholarship made a big decision-making deal for me and my family. And I think that sense of, the attention that I was getting from Culver Stockton, that they were interested in me coming here, and then, providing the added support with financial aid, that really kind of helped make the decision.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And throughout that time, what was your favorite memory?
I think coming to Culver Stockton, I remember showing up, at orientation, you don't know what to expect. I mean, you really don't. And, Culver Stockton at the time, and I assume this is still the case, had a very strong student orientation program where upperclassmen were the leaders of teams of new students who were coming in. And I really remember that time in those first few weeks of walking into something that you didn't expect, but just feeling like, the days were so long, like so much was crammed into the day from orientation, but then also when you start classes, you're going to classes, but you're meeting people, and you're, eating, meals and everything. And I it's just, I remember being both overwhelmed, but really enjoying that, meeting a whole lot of new people. And everybody was kind of in the same boat. We were all new, we didn't know each other, and everything. So I always think of those first few weeks as a kind of energetic time, that, even, thinking about my major, I was on the student newspaper as a freshman, and I was mentioning to one of the other classes that I met, the uniqueness of being able to, as a freshman, just a couple of weeks into being here at Culver Stockton, getting news assignment, writing assignments, and being able to participate even in that way, as opposed to I was a freshman and I had to work my way up on the student newspaper or something like that. So I remember just feeling like there was an opportunity to be involved, and actually people encouraging you to be involved from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm. And were you involved in Greek life at all?
Yes, I was. It wasn't something that was on my radar and my thought process when I came to Culver Stockton. But once I got here, those early weeks for the Greek system here of the semester for the Greek system here at Culver are very focused on rush and recruiting new members. And I think at the time I didn't realize that I was being rushed, but I remember now, guys who are lifelong friends, that they would, stop by. Like, I would sit on the steps of Wood Hall. At the time was a makeshift dorm. They had expanded. It used to be a music facility, but then they opened it up to put students into Wood Hall. And then some of us freshman guys were in Ziegler, which I think is now called Stone Hall, because there were so many freshmen that year. And we would sit on the steps of Wood Hall, and I pledged DU, and there were some upperclassmen DUs who, periodically after dinner would come check in, see how everyone was doing, how your class is going, and, and just engage us, and I think because of that, again, people were interested in us, because a guy who lived next door to me also pledged DU, and, and were inviting us to join in and do things. And so that was part of those first few weeks kind of experience as well, and those memories of, again, feeling like, people were eager to kind of include you in things and encouraging you to be involved, not just in, your classes, but things going on around campus. So I ended up pledging DU.
That's cool. And how has that Greek life helped you since you've left Culver?
It's a really good question, and I've talked about this several times, during my, couple of days here on the Hill. I think, the being in a fraternity, it's a unique experience because, while it's like being in some other organizations and activities that you are in on campus, it's a little different in the sense that, for us, we were the fraternity was living in a house. It was 3 cottages that stood over here just south of the Crown Student Center. And so you're living together and you're kind of building your college experience together in a way that you don't if you're just engaging with people as part of the student newspaper or another organization or club on campus. And, I think I've said often throughout my life, one of the key things that I took away from the fraternity experience, which I eventually, by my senior year, became president of DU, is that, you don't know it at the time, but you're actually thrown in with people from different backgrounds and perspectives, and sometimes you all get along and other times you don't. Sometimes, people make a big deal out of something and you think it's the biggest crisis in the world, and you look back now and think, wow, I can't believe we, it felt like we were splitting the fraternity in half over that disagreement or whatever. But I think to kind of bring that home and simplify, because it was a great experience, but I learned in that environment with the fraternity that it was one of the key places that I learned that you can disagree with folks, you can engage and actually really debate, like, what are we going to, because I'll back up and put this in context. One of the challenges we had was, by the time we got to my junior year, the college had plans to eventually take down the cottages and build, as we know, a science center and a sorority house. And so we, the DUs, who we felt like we were having momentum and growing and everything, were then asked to move to the lower level of what was then Shannon Hall, which was the freshman dorm. And we saw that as just doom. Like, how in the world are we ever going to continue to grow and everything? And that was a real tense moment as I look back, because we had brothers in the fraternity who, were very upset about it. And then there were others of us who thought, well, this is kind of the path forward and we got to figure out how to make the best of it. And so we kind of bonded together and we figured out how to make the best of it. And we had a great next year, a great rush and everything. And I think going back to where we started with the question is, I think one of the key takeaways was being thrown into an environment where I think on the surface you don't realize the growing and learning experiences that you go through living in a house, living in an organization, even figuring out, well, how do we motivate ourselves when we face something that we think is going to be not in the best interest of the fraternity going forward, but then actually turn it into something good, because we had our biggest rush year that year that we were living in Shannon Hall. So cool. I'm getting very local here in the memory.
It's great.
My name is McKeith. What's one thing you learned from here that you apply to your daily life?
That's a very good question. And it's again something I've talked a little bit about in my couple of days here. I have, and one of the focuses of my remarks at the event last night was that for me, when I think about, I have a strong attachment to this place in my mind. I have very strong memories, very fond memories of being here. And while I haven't come back to campus as much as I thought I would whenever I graduated over the years, it is someplace that's always kind of stayed with me. And I feel like throughout my career, there are many times where I realize I'm doing something or approaching something because of an experience or something I learned here at Culver Stockton. And, I think for me, being from a small town and then even being from a small college after I left here, it was very easy to fall into the, feeling kind of intimidated out of my league that, well, I'm not from a big place. I'm not from, a state university or whatever. And then as I would go on to jobs that I had further in my career, working, for elected officials, like in a governor's office, a tendency to fall into the, again, feeling like I was out of my league. And I think, Culver Stockton was one of the first places, though, that really I felt encouraged to step up and to trust my instincts and to, do my research and engage. And that I, for, I guess, lack of a better term, deserved an opportunity to be sitting around the table wherever I found myself. And so I think that's like one of the key takeaways that I have, because I got the chance here to be a part of so many different organizations, whether it was in Greek life or within the journalism program, or as we were discussing earlier, I was a part of the cheerleading squad here, where you were building a team, you were working with people that brought a lot of different talents and skills to the mix. And I guess, just to kind of cut to the chase, I think the point that what I learned here, the experiences I had here, were just as good, just as relevant as what people are having in other places, and that there's no reason that that I should feel intimidated or not as prepared as someone else. So there's a lot you learn here.
You said you were involved with cheerleading, Greek life, and then the newspaper. Were there any other activities or programs that you were involved in here at Culver?
Yes, I mean, I was involved in several different things. I also did work study. I worked in the college public relations office. That was the name of it at the time, which is one of the things that also informed my career a bit, which I'm happy to talk about. In addition to the newspaper, I was on at the time, the college had a yearbook, and it was called the Dome, obviously, I think for obvious reasons. And an interesting story there that I've also relayed was, I'd been on the high school yearbook, and when I came here, my freshman year, I was on the newspaper, and I thought, oh, well, I want to be on the yearbook my next year. And the summer after my freshman year, early that summer, a woman, Sharon Illa, who worked she was an employee in the public relations office here. She was also the yearbook advisor. She called me and said, you're the only student who signed up for yearbook, so I guess that means you're the editor. And I remember feeling panicked, because what are you the editor of if you're the only student? And, in that conversation, I think Sharon must have said some things that made clear that she wasn't going to kind of throw in the towel and say we won't have a yearbook, and we're not going to drop yearbook. And so I think at the end of that conversation, I wasn't going to drop yearbook either. Although I'm sure that would have been an option. I would just have said, I'm going to drop the class and go back to the newspaper. But I talk about this a lot because it seems like not a big deal. If you think, oh, it's the college yearbook, oh well. But from that moment, when she said, I guess you're the editor, I spent the summer then reaching out to other journalism students, even students who weren't in journalism, and recruited people to join the yearbook. And by the time we got here on campus in late August, early September, I think there were 12 to 14 members of the yearbook staff. We produced a yearbook. We spent a lot of time researching, like, what does it actually mean to produce a yearbook? What does it take to produce a yearbook? We worked hard. We did our research. We put together a yearbook. After it was produced, we submitted it like you do to the National Scholastic Press for review, and we got great reviews and felt very encouraged. And then the next year, I wasn't the editor, I was what we called the student advisor, but it was a lot of the same people. We did it again. We set about producing a yearbook, and took the advice and the information we got in the review to try to make the yearbook better. And that year, the Culver Stockton yearbook went out for review, came back, and we were named an All-American yearbook. And we were in the company of, big top journalism schools, Ball State University, Syracuse University. Here's Culver Stockton's little yearbook on the shelf with these huge, thick, big university yearbooks, top journalism programs. And, that was a big deal. It was a really big deal for those of us who had the chance to build that team, that yearbook staff, and learn an aspect of journalism, what we were here to learn, but also have a lot of fun doing it and document what we thought was important that was going on campus over the course of a year, and put it all in a bound yearbook. And so that was a pretty exceptional experience for me. And as I look forward, or as I look back on my career, I can see many times where some of those same skills, some of those same things I learned in that yearbook situation of building a team, figuring out what skills we need, who has the right skills to do what job, even figuring out what's the editorial direction, which is not a phrase I would have used then, but like we would have said, what's our theme, what things are we going to cover, all of that, of building a team, setting goals, building a product, a timeline for producing that product. those are those are skills that I developed in that yearbook. Again, may not seem like a big deal on the surface, but in that yearbook experience that has come into play so many times over my career.
You already mentioned that you stayed in the cottages or Ziegler Hall. What was one thing that you liked about that?
When I came here as a freshman and I was in Ziegler and now again, I think it's called Stone Hall. It was unique because unlike most freshman guys, their experience was Shannon Hall. And I was on the third floor and our window actually looked out on the dome. And so in some ways, I feel like I was given like this picturesque Culver Stockton experience of, having one of the best views on campus as my freshman dorm. And that was a great experience because I think a little bit unique to, had I been in Shannon Hall, we had upperclassmen that we were mixed in even on our floor with. So there was a little bit of a uniqueness to that experience. The cottages, which again were where the Delta Upsilon lived at the time, they were unique first because they looked different than just about anything else on campus. They were these white, wood siding buildings. I think they'd previously been faculty housing. They were adapted for, three of them in a row adapted for students to live in. And they were, again, as I was mentioning, just kind of across from the student center, and there was a big grassy space between the cottages and the student center. And so, it was great when I was living there for a couple of years, you were in the center of campus. Now, I remember building homecoming floats in that grassy area out between the student center and the cottages. And so anything we were doing out there, other people were engaging, stopping to play Frisbee or coming over to look at the progress on our float and everything. So one of my, I guess, greatest memories about being in the cottages was that sense of being in the center of campus between, the other Greek houses that are right here, the student center. It just felt like you were, that again, you had the opportunity to really engage with what was going on campus in a way that maybe we wouldn't if we lived in another, part of campus. I don't want to name a place like Weldon Hall. That seems very far away at the time. And you'd always think, wow, I'm glad I don't live in Weldon. You have to walk so far, which seems so funny now.
Thank you.
We're going to move ahead now to life at Culver Stockton and the first steps into your career.
Hi, my name is Kiana. So my first question is, what was your first job after graduating from Culver Stockton?
Good question. I made a decision in my senior year to go to graduate school, and I went straight through from Culver Stockton. I then went to Ball State University and earned a degree or a master's degree in public relations. As I was coming out of Ball State and searching, I briefly had a job as a layout technician for Macmillan Publishing, which was a book publishing company at the time. And I was on a team. I literally would sit at a computer and in desktop publishing and flow the text of cookbooks into the template and then lay out the cookbook that then went on the shelf to be sold in a bookstore. I was there for about 6 months, but at the time I was very eager to get into a media relations role. I wanted to do media relations, be a spokesperson for an organization. I was also very interested in government and politics, and so I was very fortunate that I was able to land my first, what I would call real job. I was a public information officer for the Indiana State Department of Health, and I was there for 2 years. And so I was doing just an array of stuff. I was laying out newsletters for different departments within the state health department. I was dealing with incoming media inquiries on various public health related things every day, issuing statements, helping put together promotional and informational campaigns for things like, getting your flu shots or cancer screenings or things like that, that were real public health priorities at the time. And working in a department where there were other people who were doing similar jobs as me and supporting just kind of the goals of that agency. It was a great, very interesting place to work. You learn a lot. I think one of the great opportunities for those of us who are interested in communications is that virtually every organization needs communications. So there's so many places you can do the type of work, communications work you're interested in, but do it in a field that you're also interested in. So it's almost like a double bonus. And I wouldn't claim that public health was an area that I was strongly interested in when I took that job, but I certainly learned a lot. In addition to continuing to develop my communication skills, I learned a lot about public health and the implications to our community, and why even things like vaccine campaigns and stuff like that, and why those are important from a public health perspective.
So my name's Riley, and my question was, compared to your colleagues at work right now, do you feel like Culver prepared you the best it could for the work world?
That's a very quick one for me to answer, at least initially. Yes, I do. I'm fortunate in the jobs that I've had throughout my career, including the one I'm in now. I've had the chance to work with some really great people, but for some of the reasons that we've already talked about, I do feel like Culver Stockton really prepared me to take on the types of jobs that I've had the opportunity to take on in my career. I think partly because of, as I was mentioning earlier, being encouraged to engage and take something on. I mean, I go back to, again, the Sharon Illa experience with yearbook. I mean, she could have as easily as me said, okay, well, we just won't produce a yearbook. And she, without, prescribing or demanding, she basically gave me the space to kind of on my own think, oh, well, I can, I know this other student that was on yearbook, I bet I could get them to join. And, I had that experience of not just building a team, but actually probably, one of the earliest experiences in my life where, whether I knew it at the time or not, a challenge was put in front of me, and I didn't actually know how I was going to tackle that challenge, but I was given the space to figure that out and to try and, even, call this person and they would say no, but call two other people and they would say yes. And also dig into, because as I mentioned, I know it's funny we keep coming back to the yearbook, but I mentioned I was a photographer on the yearbook in high school. So it's not like I had any experience doing layout and design. And at that time, desktop publishing, computers on your desk were actually a very new thing. And so having the opportunity to challenge myself to learn, what it took to actually get whatever your goal was, whatever the challenge was, to meet that, was an experience that I had here at Culver Stockton many times over. And I would honestly say, if I had gone as an undergrad to a large universities are great, state universities, private universities, the right place for a whole lot of people. It wasn't probably the right place for me, and I just feel very fortunate that I came here and was given the chance to do the things that I did while I was on the Hill, because I do, as I was saying earlier, there are many times in my career that, people, and all of you will probably encounter this, they'll very, forthright come to you and say, well, here's the problem, and they give it to you to figure out how you're going to solve it. And I really do feel like I developed a lot of problem solving skills, team building skills, and organizational skills here in a way that at a large school where maybe something like the yearbook or newspaper, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to take on a leadership role until my junior or senior year. I was doing that, as a freshman, sophomore, and really was given the opportunity to build those skills. So yeah, I felt very prepared.
Sweet. Thank you.
As you've mentioned before, you kind of came into Culver not knowing what you really wanted to do, and then obviously it sounds like you were able to grow and develop a lot. What were your career goals starting Culver as opposed to after, once you were able to graduate?
It's funny because I'm, and this will, I'm sure, happen to all of you if it hasn't already. People always say, what's your 5-year plan? And I don't know that I ever had a 5-year plan, and I don't think I did when I came into Culver Stockton. I just knew that, like, for instance, choosing a journalism degree gave me the opportunity to do and be a part of some of the things that I had fun doing in high school. And I don't want to make it sound like I wasn't interested in academics, but academics were a little bit more, at the time I viewed it as, that's kind of an ends to a means. If I'm a journalism major, then I get to be on the student newspaper or the student yearbook or something like that, things that I had fun doing before. And as I was here, I mentioned I worked in the college public relations office. And, while I was a journalism major, I think even from the comments I've shared, you can probably tell I wasn't thinking I'm going to go be a newspaper reporter. There are a lot of people that's their strong interest. It just wasn't where I saw myself at the time, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I liked doing some of the communications related activities. And so when I became aware of the college public relations office, that was the first time that I ever became aware of a career that you could do using the same skills that wasn't being a reporter. And so I was really introduced here to the idea of a career in public relations or communications. And I think without that, I don't know where I would have gone, but I very quickly, I think, decided in my mind that, this is what I want to do. I didn't necessarily know if I wanted to do it at a college, for instance, but that was where I had gotten the exposure to the career path. And that informed then where I went for graduate school, because I felt like if this is what I'm doing, I need to learn a little bit more that's focused on the kind of technical skills of a career in public relations and communications, as opposed to being a news reporter. And so that's one of the reasons I chose to go to graduate school. But that's, I guess, a little bit of insight into how I ended up choosing the career path that I chose.
Thank you for sharing that. That's great. You're giving us some backstory to your experiences here. Keith, your questions next.
Yeah. What's one thing you wish someone would have told you while you were a student here?
That's always a good question to ask someone. I think I would go back to something I alluded to before, and I literally did get this advice later in my career. It's that your instincts are good, you should trust them. And as opposed to, again, I will readily admit, being from a small town, and then even after I left Culver, being from a small school, would find myself in a room with work colleagues and others, and feel a little bit intimidated that I would have a thought or an idea, but I would think, maybe it's not a good idea, I shouldn't say it. And so I wish that I said last night in my remarks, Culver Stockton was the first place that told me I didn't need to feel intimidated or out of my league. It took me a few years to actually develop the ability to believe that, and so I do. Well, I feel like I was given, told that in both indirect and direct ways here. Maybe I wish someone would have emphasized it even more.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Elijah has a couple questions about your personal growth.
Hi, excuse me, I'm Elijah. I just was wondering, what was the biggest misconception people have about you?
Wow. I think a lot of feedback I've gotten over the years is that when people first meet me, I tend to be a little quieter, a little more reserved. Even as recently as my current job, I remember a colleague saying to me, I wish I was like you, and would sit back and hear the conversation first before you engage. And so I think sometimes, because once I and maybe this goes back to that lack of confidence that I mentioned having when I was younger, I do tend to kind of sit back, get a lay of the land, hear the conversation, and then start interjecting. And so I think maybe a misconception is that my lack of immediate, jumping into the conversation or guiding the conversation or offering direction or recommendations are that I am not engaging. I don't know, maybe.
It makes sense. Yeah. And then my last question is, did you have to change your mindset to be in the position that you are in now?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think, there's a lot of, when I think about when I look at the role that I have now, there's a lot of a lot of the same skills that I've had to use and draw on in other jobs. Having worked in a lot of large organizations, complex organizations, the bureaucracy of government, because I've been in a number of communications and other roles related to government. So there's a lot of similarities from the standpoint of working in a complex, large organization. I think the mindset, and it was an interesting mindset shift that I had when I came into my role at Harvard 7 years ago, was that was the college campus environment, which in so many ways is extremely familiar to me because I lived on a college campus. I was a student on a college campus, and I walk through campus now at Harvard and see and the things people are doing seem very familiar to me. They're going to class, they're playing frisbee out on the lawn or whatever it may be, and everything. So I think there was a little bit of a mindset shift of getting back to the kind of the college campus life, and that a college campus doesn't operate on a 9-to-5 schedule like the business world or the government world. And so there's a little bit of a shift there, but it makes for a very interesting place.
Thank you for that. And now we'll hand things over to Riley, who has a question about a big job decision you made after graduating from Culver.
So my last question for you was, when looking for a job, why did you choose an Ivy League school rather than a state school?
It's interesting. An interesting question, because I certainly did not set out to. I didn't say to myself, "Oh, I'm going to go work at Harvard." I had been in about from like 2015, 2016. I was working for a company that ended up getting acquired by a larger company, and I had decided that I didn't want to stay on with the larger company. So I started. Fortunately, I was able to put together a handful of clients, and I started freelancing, doing communications work to give myself a little bit of time to decide what I wanted to do next. The one thing I didn't want to do is stay a freelancer, because I do really like being a part of an organization, being a part of kind of pushing forward on achieving a mission, achieving goals, and working as part of a team. And so I kept thinking at the time, well, what types of organizations would I want to work in? And this is a true story. I came back to working as a student worker in the public relations office here and thinking that a college campus was interesting. There's always activities going on. It's, if you're looking for intellectual stimulation, you can get that on a college campus. If you're looking for, arts and performance opportunities, sporting events, obviously being affiliated with a college or university, you have the opportunity to do those things. But also just, the interesting subject matter. And from a communications perspective, a college or university offers, when you just think of like an audience perspective, you've got so many audiences, students, alumni, you've got faculty and employees, you've got the surrounding community that you're a part of. So I started to zero in on higher ed. Seemed like an interesting place to work at this point in my career. So I just started reaching out to people I knew who had connections or were either working in higher ed. And I had a former boss whose husband had been a college president at a small college in the New England area. And I reached out to her and her husband for advice. And it's really kind of that age-old story of networking where they said, one of them said, "Oh, well, we know the vice president for communications and public affairs at Harvard. You should meet with them," not because they thought there was a job, but it was more of, that networking, as I know a lot of people tell you should do, and that it pays off, is, meet people, reach out to people, ask to have the opportunity to sit down and have an informational conversation with them. And so I did that with the vice president, who's now my boss. And several months later, there was an opening in the department, and he forwarded the link and just simply said, "If you're interested, we've got a position open." And I applied and went through a lengthy interview process and got the job. And so I guess my part of my answer to the question is I hadn't set my sights on Harvard, but through my networking and conversations and just seeing what opportunities were out there, it's sort of where I ended up.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Your insights have been super helpful to all of us here in the studio and also those that watch the podcast. And before we close, is there anything else you'd like to share, like to add about your connection to CSC or your experiences?
I guess one of the themes of a lot of the conversations that I've been having in classes and then at the lecture last night was, this place, Culver Stockton, has always meant a lot to me. I had a really great time here. I mean that in all respects. I mean, from an academic standpoint, and what I learned, the relationships that I was able to develop with faculty, I think is another, it's another plus of being at a small school. Those were very impactful for me in helping me figure out what I wanted to do and even figure out what I was interested in. The social and peer relationships I developed here were really important. And those are things that have stayed with me, throughout my life. I mean, I have good college friends who, later in life, we ended up living in the same, same communities, living in Indianapolis. I have a fraternity brother that we, lived in the same neighborhood or houses a couple blocks away for, 12 years, and so to have those ties back to Culver Stockton is something that's always been present and apparent in my life. And as I've maybe shared in this conversation, even professionally, there have been lots of moments where I always look back and something I'm doing reminds me of, or I'm drawing on some experience that I had here. And so, I think one of the things I said last night in the remarks that I was giving was, as I was getting ready to come back for this visit to Culver Stockton, I really pushed myself to answer the question for myself of why this place is so important to me, like all these years later, to still feel that it had such an impact. And it's really just that. I got to do a lot of things here, and I was encouraged to do a lot of things here that, for me, really kind of changed, I think, the direction of my life from when I came to Culver Stockton and when I left.
Jonathan Swain, it's been wonderful sharing time with you today on behalf of our History of Communication class. Thank you for sharing your time and perspective with us. This has been Voices of the Hill, a podcast produced by the Communication Program at Culver Stockton College in Canton, Missouri. To hear more conversations like this, follow or subscribe where you get your podcast. A big thank you goes to Remington Yates, our technical director for this podcast. Thanks, Remington. And I'm Dustin Pruitt, an assistant professor of communication here at CSC. Thanks for listening, and go Wildcats!